The man who built this hotel was legally sold as livestock. History calls him a silent genius. That's the lie. In 1832, he was locked in a glass tank and displayed as a monster for coins. 5 years later, he secretly owned the circus that exhibited him. And the night they tried to sell his body to a medical academy, he bought his own freedom instead. Tonight I'll show you how a man the world called Frog turned humiliation into capital, and how he used silence as a weapon. But here's the real question. How does someone who is legally property become the owner of the people who tried to cage him? Let us go back. Far back. Before the railways cut through the mountains like scarves. Let's go to 1832. Can you hear that rain? It's not the clean rain we get out here on the porch in the evening. It is the gray, greasy rain of a northern industrial town. The kind that tastes like coal smoke and tastes like failure. I want you to imagine a young man standing in that rain. His name was Victor. He didn't have a last name, not one that anyone cared to write down. On the inside, Victor was a scholar. He could read 3 languages. He could look at a bridge and tell you exactly where the stress points were just by the angle of the iron. He had the mind of an architect and the soul of a poet. But nobody in that town ever saw his mind. They couldn't get past the surface. You see, Victor was born with a condition, a rarity. His skin wasn't soft or pale like yours or mine. It was thick. It was dark, mottled with patterns that looked like wet river stones or the bark of an ancient oak tree after a storm. It was rough to the touch, and it covered him from the crown of his head to the soles of his bare feet. It was distinct. It was harmless. It was just skin. But in 1832, people didn't have words like dermatological condition. They had words like curse. They had words like demon. They had words like toad. He tried, you know. I found a letter he wrote to a mill owner in Manchester, beautifully penmanship, ink as precise as a razor. He asked for work as a clerk. He didn't ask to be seen. He offered to work in the back room, organizing the shipping manifests. Do you know what the reply was? I have it here. A scrawl across the bottom of his application. We do not hire bad omens. Do not return. That was his reality. He walked into a bakery to buy bread with the last copper coin in his pocket, and the baker's wife screamed. She didn't just ask him to leave. She screamed like she had seen death itself. She threw hot water at his feet. Not because he was aggressive. Victor was the gentlest soul you could meet. But because he didn't fit the shape of a human being that she had in her small, frightened head. When you are that hungry, when the cold gets into your bones so deep that you stop shivering and just start aching, dignity becomes a very expensive luxury. Victor learned quickly that his mind was useless if his body was illegal. He slept under a bridge that night. I can picture him there, huddling against the damp brick, listening to the carriages rattle overhead, carrying people who were warm, people who had smooth skin, people who belonged. He must have looked at his own hands, those thick, textured fingers, and wondered why God would give him the brain of a genius and wrap it in a package that the world wanted to throw in the river. And then morning came. And with the morning came the wagons. They rolled into town like a fever dream. Bright red paint peeling off the sides, gold leaf that was mostly yellow mud, horses with plumes on their heads that looked tired and majestic all at once. the traveling spectacular. That's what they called it. A circus, a moving kingdom of the strange and the beautiful. Victor watched them from the shadows of the alley. He saw the acrobat stretching. He saw the fire eater testing his torch. But mostly he saw the man in the center. The manager. A man in a top hat that was a little too tall, a vest that was a little too tight, shouting orders with a voice that sounded like gravel crushing glass. Victor didn't want to join them. He knew what they were. He knew that for a man like him, the circus wasn't a career. It was a surrender. It was admitting that the baker's wife was right, that he didn't belong in the streets. He belonged in a tent. But hunger is a cruel argument. Hunger makes you do things that pride forbids. So Victor stepped out of the alley. He walked up to the caravan with the gold letters on the door. He didn't slouch. He stood tall. He walked with the grace of a man who knows he is worth more than the rags on his back. He knocked. The manager opened the door. He was eating a leg of chicken, grease shining on his chin. He looked at Victor. He didn't scream. He didn't throw water. He stopped chewing. He looked Victor up and down, slow, like a man appraising a horse at an auction. He looked at the heavy ridges of skin on Victor's forehead. He looked at the patterns on his neck, and then he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who just found a gold coin in the gutter. I can read, Victor said. His voice was deep, cultured, precise. I can write. I can keep your accounts. I am strong. I can lift heavy loads. I am looking for employment. The manager wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He laughed, a dry, wheezing sound. Accounts? He said. You think I need an accountant? Look at you, boy. You're a walking portrait, but not behind a desk. He stepped out of the wagon, circling Victor. They call you names, don't they? Frog boy, lizard man, beast. My name is Victor. Not anymore, the manager said. Victor is a name for a clerk. Victor is a name for a nobody. You are a discovery. I have a spot for you. It pays room and board. It pays 2 coins a week, and you will be the star. Victor hesitated. 2 coins a week meant bread. It meant a roof. It meant living. I will work, Victor said, but I will not be mocked. The manager grinned, putting a heavy arm around Victor's shoulders. The fabric of his coat smelled of old tobacco and cheap lavender water. Mocked? My dear boy, they will worship you. They will pay to see you. You will be a king in your own court. But, he held up a finger, there is a condition. Victor stiffened. What condition? You don't speak. The manager leaned in close, his breath hot and stale. The people, they pay for mystery. They pay for the wild. If you open your mouth and speak the Queen's English like an Oxford professor, you break the spell. A talking monster is just a sad man with a disease, a silent monster. That is a beast from the deep. That is a nightmare come to life, and people pay double for nightmares. He pulled a contract from his pocket. It was already crumpled. He smoothed it out on the side of the wagon. Sign here. You make a sound in front of the public, even a sneeze, even a whisper, and you forfeit your pay. You are the swamp thing now, silent, dangerous, unknown. Do we have a deal? Victor looked at the paper. The handwriting was terrible, misspelled, cramped. He could see 3 loopholes in the first paragraph alone. But his stomach twisted with hunger. He looked at the gray sky. He looked at the mud on his feet. He took the quill. And then he did something brilliant, something that told you exactly who Victor was, even back then. He knew how to write his name. He could have signed it with a flourish. But he looked the manager in the eye, lowered the quill, and made a clumsy, jagged X on the line. He lied. He let the manager believe he was an idiot. He let the manager believe he was exactly what he looked like, a dumb brute found in the woods. He hid his greatest weapon inside his own silence. Because Victor knew that if a man thinks you are stupid, he will say things in front of you that he would never say in front of a witness. He signed the X, and in that moment, he became a spy in his own life. The manager snatched the paper back, delighted. "Welcome home, Frog," he said, and then he tossed something at Victor. It wasn't a uniform. It wasn't a suit. It was a loincloth made of rough burlap and dyed green. "Put that on. We open in an hour." That was the beginning. That was the descent. They built him a set. They called it the terrarium. It wasn't a cage, not exactly. It was worse. It was a glass-fronted tank, 3 sides of wood, 1 side of thick glass, filled with mud and stagnant water. They put fake reeds in the corners. They painted the back wall to look like a jungle that never existed. Victor had to squat there. He had to crouch in the muck, half submerged, for 6 hours a night. I want you to imagine the humiliation of a man who knows the history of the Roman Empire, who can calculate the trajectory of a falling star, sitting in dirt while strangers bang on the glass. The crowds came. Oh, they came in droves. It was the curiosity of the era. They paid their pennies to feel superior. They stood on the other side of that glass pointing. Mothers lifting their children up to see the river monster. Men tapping the glass with their canes. "Look at the scales," they would say. "Look at the eyes. No soul behind them. Just an animal." For the first few weeks, Victor thought he would die of shame. He held his breath. He stared at a spot on the floor, trying to dissolve. He learned the rhythm of the crowd, the gasp when the curtain was pulled back, the nervous laughter, the silence when he moved. He realized that silence was heavy. It had weight. One night, a Tuesday, somewhere near Birmingham, a drunkard stumbled up to the glass. He shouted, spitting on the pane, "Ugly, you ugly devil." He was trying to get a reaction. He wanted the monster to roar, or to cry, or to smash the glass. Victor slowly turned his head. He didn't roar, he didn't frown, he just looked. He looked at the drunkard with those deep, dark eyes. He looked at him with absolute calm intelligence. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man's cheap coat, his red nose, his shaking hands. The drunkard stopped shouting. He stepped back. He looked around, suddenly nervous. He expected a beast. He found a judge. The silence in the tank wasn't empty, it was observant. The man lowered his eyes and walked away unsettled. In that moment, Victor understood something profound. He was trapped in a box, yes, but he was safe behind the glass. They were the ones on display. He could see them, but they couldn't see him. Not really. They saw a mirror of their own fears. And more importantly, from his glass box, Victor could see everything else. He could see the manager's booth. It was positioned right across from the terrarium. Night after night, while squatting in the mud, Victor watched the manager work the gate. And Victor started to count. He counted the number of tickets sold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Family of 5. That's 10 pence. He counted the coins going into the lockbox. He counted the supplies coming off the delivery wagons. He didn't have paper. He didn't have a slate. So he did the math in his head. He built a ledger in his mind, column by column. He realized that the hay for the horses was costing 3 times what it should. He noticed that the roustabouts were stealing oil from the lamps. He noticed that on nights when it rained, the gate receipts were down by 40%, yet the manager still spent the same amount on whiskey. It became a game, a survival mechanism. While the crowd gaped at his skin, he was auditing their pockets. One evening late, after the crowds had gone and the lamps were dimmed, Victor sat in his tank. He wasn't contractually obligated to be there after hours, but he had nowhere else to go that was warm. The camp was asleep. The only sound was the crackle of the dying campfire and the snoring of the lions in the adjacent wagon. The manager was sitting on a barrel nearby, trying to balance the week's books by the light of a flickering lantern. He was cursing, scratching his head, smearing ink on his face. He muttered, 12 shillings, minus the feed. Where did the 4 pounds go? Victor watched him through the glass. The man was incompetent. He was trying to add columns that didn't match. He was bleeding money, and he didn't even know where the wound was. Victor shifted in the straw. The manager looked up, startled. Go to sleep, frog, he grumbled. Don't stare at your betters. Victor stayed silent. He respected the contract, but his mind was screaming. You missed the carryover from Thursday. You forgot the bribe to the local constable. You're losing £1 a day because you can't do simple arithmetic. The manager gave up, slammed the book shut, and took a long drink from a flask. Ruined, he whispered to the night. This whole cursed circus is going to be ruined by Christmas. He fell asleep right there on the crate, the ledger sliding out of his hand and falling into the dirt. Victor waited. He waited until the breathing was deep and rhythmic. He waited until the camp was dead silent. Then slowly, quietly, he pushed open the back latch of his tank. He stepped out of the mud. He crept across the cold ground, his patterned feet making no sound in the dust. He reached down and picked up the ledger. It was heavy, bound in red leather. He opened it. The pages were a mess. Ink blots, crossed out numbers, coffee stains. It was chaos. It was the diary of a sinking ship. Victor turned the pages, his eyes scanning the numbers, correcting them instantly in his head. Loss, loss, theft, error, loss. He stood there in the moonlight, a man who the world thought was a beast, holding the financial soul of his captor in his hands. And he realized something. The manager had the whip. The manager had the key to the cage. The manager had the loud voice and the fancy suit. But the manager was an idiot. And Victor was the only one in the entire camp who knew that they were all sailing off the edge of the world. He looked at the sleeping man. He looked at the pen lying in the dirt. He had a choice. He could put the book back. He could go back to his mud and let the circus fail. Let the manager go bankrupt. Let the whole wretched place burn down and starve. That would be justice, wouldn't it? But if the circus failed, Victor starved too. If the circus disbanded, he was back under the bridge in the gray rain. Victor knelt down. He dipped the pen into the inkwell on the barrel. He checked the manager's snoring one last time. And then, for the first time in years, he touched pen to paper. He didn't sign his name. He didn't write a poem. He crossed out the total at the bottom of the page. And next to it, in elegant, perfect script, he wrote the correct number. Then he turned the page and corrected the next one, and the next. He worked for an hour. He balanced the week. He found the missing 4 pounds. It was a simple addition error on Tuesday. He fixed it. He closed the book. He placed it gently back on the manager's lap. Then he went back to his tank, closed the latch, and sat in the darkness, waiting for dawn. The next morning, the shouting woke him up. The morning after Victor fixed the ledger, the manager didn't say thank you. He didn't ask who had turned his chaotic scribbles into perfect arithmetic. He simply looked at the book, blinked his watery eyes, and assumed the whiskey had cleared his head. Or perhaps he knew exactly who had done it, and his pride was too fragile to admit that the swamp creature knew more about compounding interest than he did. He simply shoved the book into his coat pocket and barked at the roustabouts to load the wagons. We were heading north toward the storm season. And let me tell you about storms in the 1830s. When the sky turned that bruised shade of purple and the birds stopped singing, you didn't just worry about getting wet. You worried about survival. The circus tent, that canvas cathedral, it was everything. It was the church, the bank, and the home. If the tent ripped, the season was over. If the main pole snapped, people died. It was outside of Leeds where the weather broke. I remember reading the old weather almanacs from that year. Floods in the valley, hail the size of musket balls. The wind hit the encampment like a hammer. It came at midnight. The horses were screaming, tearing at their tethers. The main tent began to groan, a low, terrifying sound of wood bending past its limit. The crew was panic-stricken. These were strong men, hammer swingers and heavy lifters, but they weren't engineers. They were running in circles, tightening the wrong ropes, pulling when they should have been slackening. The wind caught the southern flank of the canvas, and the whole structure lifted, threatening to turn into a giant kite that would drag them all into the abyss. The manager was shouting useless orders, his voice lost in the gale. "Hold it down! Hold it down!" he screamed, as if gravity would listen to him. And then a voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, deep, resonant, and calm. Slacken the western guy lines, release the tension on the center pole, or it will snap. Triangulate the anchors on the lee side, now. The crew froze. They looked around. They saw Victor. He had broken out of his glass tank. He was standing in the mud, wearing only that ridiculous burlap loincloth, the rain sluicing off his patterned skin. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a general. "Do it!" he roared, pointing at the specific ropes that were vibrating with lethal tension. "You, give me slack. You, drive that stake at a 45-degree angle. Do it now, or we lose the canvas." The shock was so total that the men obeyed without thinking. They stopped seeing. The frogman. They saw a man who knew the geometry of survival. They slacked the lines. The tent sighed, settling back onto the earth. The tension redistributed exactly as Victor had calculated. He moved among them, grabbing ropes with hands that were twice as strong as any other man's, securing knots that would hold against a hurricane. For an hour, he directed the battle against the wind. And when the storm passed, leaving the camp battered but standing, there was a silence louder than the thunder. The crew stood panting in the mud. The manager stood by the wagon wheel, his face pale. Victor stood in the center of them all. He wiped the rain from his eyes. He didn't cower. He didn't shrink back into his role. He looked at the manager and said in perfectly enunciated English, "You are using hemp rope for the tension lines. It stretches when wet. You need manila. I calculated the shear force. You were lucky tonight. Next time, gravity won't be so forgiving." The manager stared. The crew stared. The mask was off. The secret was out. The thing in the cage wasn't a beast. He was the smartest man on the lot. That night, they struck a bargain. Victor sat in the manager's private caravan. He refused to sit on the floor. He sat on a stool. He made his demand. "I saved your tent. I saved your season. I am done with the mud. I want to perform as I am. No more swamp beast. I want to present a mentalism act. I want to show them I have a mind." The manager poured 2 glasses of brandy. He looked at Victor with a strange expression, part cunning, part pity. "You want to wear a tuxedo?" he asked. "You want to stand on stage and do card tricks? You want to recite Shakespeare?" "I want to be seen," Victor said. "I am tired of being looked at. I want to be listened to." The manager swirled his glass. "Very well," he said softly. "You saved the show. You deserve a reward. Tomorrow night, you go on. The gentleman mystic. You can do your math tricks. You can read their minds. We'll put you in the finest silk. We'll give you the spotlight." Victor should have been suspicious. He should have asked why the manager agreed so easily. But hope is a dangerous drug, especially for a man who has lived in the dark. Victor thought the world was rational. He thought that if he showed people his intelligence, they would look past his skin. He thought competence was the cure for prejudice. Oh, how young he was. The next night, the tent was packed. The air smelled of sawdust and cheap perfume. The manager stepped into the ring, his voice booming. "Ladies and gentlemen, forget the beasts of the field. Tonight we present a marvel of the modern age. A mind as sharp as a diamond. A scholar, a gentleman. I give you the professor." The band played a fanfare. The curtains parted. Victor stepped out. He had spent 3 hours grooming. He had oiled his skin so the patterns shone like polished dark wood. He was wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo, a white shirt, a silk cravat. He stood upright, his posture perfect. He looked regal. He walked to the center of the ring. He bowed deeply. "Good evening," he said, his voice projecting to the back rows. "Tonight, I shall attempt to unlock the mysteries of the unseen." He expected a hush. He expected intrigue. Instead, the crowd rippled with unease. "I've studied the psychology of it in these old books. It's called dissonance. See, if a dog walks on 2 legs, you laugh. But if a wolf puts on a suit and speaks like a school teacher, you don't laugh. You recoil. It feels wrong. It feels like a mockery of nature." The audience didn't know how to process Victor. They had paid to see a freak. They had paid to feel safe in their own normality compared to his wildness. But here was a man who looked wrong, but acted better than them. He spoke better than the coal miners in the front row. He moved with more elegance than the shopkeepers in the box seats. They felt tricked. They felt threatened. Victor began his act. He asked a man in the front row to pick a number. He squared it instantly in his head. 144, Victor announced proudly. "Stop it," a woman shouted. "Stop talking." Victor froze. "Madam, I assure you, it ain't right," a man yelled from the back. "Why is it wearing clothes? Make it stop talking. It sounds like a person." The unease turned into aggression quickly. A tomato flew from the darkness. and splattered against Victor's white shirt, leaving a stain like fresh blood, then a cabbage, then a stone. "Show us the beast," they chanted. "Take off the coat. Get back in the mud." Victor stood there, debris raining down on him. He didn't run. He just looked at them. He looked at the faces twisted in anger, not because he was dangerous, but because he had dared to be dignified. They didn't want him to be smart. They needed him to be less than them so they could feel like something. The manager, standing in the wings, didn't stop it. In fact, Victor saw him smiling. The manager had known. He had let Victor walk into the fire to learn a lesson. "This is your place, boy. Don't try to leave it." Victor bowed one last time, stiffly, ignoring the food pelting his face. He turned and walked off stage, his tuxedo ruined, his heart turning into something colder than the winter wind. He went to his dressing area. He took off the coat. He took off the cravat. He folded them neatly. He didn't cry. Crying implies surprise. Victor wasn't surprised anymore. He was educated. He wiped the vegetable rot from his chest. He looked in the mirror at his reflected face. The ridges, the thickness, the difference. He realized then that he could not win their love. He could cure cancer. He could recite the Bible backward. He could build a cathedral with his bare hands, and they would still throw stones because his skin frightened them. "Visibility is a trap," he whispered to the mirror. "They will never let me stand in the light." So he decided to own the dark. Look at this page in the registry, right here. Look at the date. November 1832. This is the moment everything changed. Before this date, the circus accounts are written in a chaotic, drunken scroll. That was the manager. But look after this date. Look at the lines. Look at the numbers. Sharp, precise, elegant. This is Victor's handwriting. He didn't quit the circus. He didn't run away. He went to the manager's wagon that very night, while the crowd was still dispersing. He walked in without knocking. He wasn't wearing the tuxedo. He was wearing the loincloth, but he was holding the ledger. "I will never speak on stage again," Victor said. His voice was flat, dead. "I will go back to the tank. I will be your swamp monster. I will growl. I will eat raw fish if you want. I will give them the nightmare they paid for." The manager chuckled, pouring a drink. "I knew you'd come around. You learned your lesson, eh? You're an animal, Victor. A valuable one, but an animal." "However," Victor continued, ignoring the insult, "you were broke. I saw the receipts. You are losing 3 pounds a week on transport. You are being cheated by the livery stable. You are 2 weeks away from insolvency." The manager stopped smiling. "I will make you a deal," Victor said. "I will be the beast by day, but by night you will give me a private wagon. You will give me a desk, oil for the lamp, and this ledger. I will run the logistics. I will handle the contracts. I will fix your rot. And in exchange, you will pay me 5% of every pound I save you." And he paused. "And nobody, absolutely nobody, is to know. I do not want credit. I do not want my name on the bills. I want to be a ghost. You will take the credit for my work. You will be the genius manager who turned the show around. I will just be the thing in the mud." The manager squinted at him. It was a deal with the devil, he thought. But the manager was greedy, and he was lazy. He hated doing the math. He hated negotiating with farmers for hay prices. 5%? The manager scoffed. 10%, Victor corrected him calmly. "Or you can explain to the creditors Next week, while you have no assets." The manager laughed. He clapped his hands. "Done. You can be my little secret secretary. The shadow clerk. Oh, this is rich. A frog doing my taxes. Fine. Fine. Do the books. Just make sure the tank is full by curtain time." And so the pivot began. They bought a small wagon. It was painted black with no windows, only a skylight. Victor moved in, and by day he performed. He squatted in the fake swamp, enduring the stares, the taunts, the pennies thrown at his head. He became the best monster they had ever seen. He didn't just sit there anymore. He played the role with a terrifying commitment, knowing it was just a costume. But when the curtain fell, that was when the real show started. Victor would wash off the mud, enter his black wagon, and light the lamp. He created a persona. He ordered stationery printed with the name Mr. Shade. He wrote letters to venues in the next town. "Dear Sir, regarding the rental of your fairgrounds, I represent the Grand Traveling Spectacular. We are prepared to offer you a distinct arrangement." His letters were brilliant, firm, polite, financially sound. He negotiated group rates for the train travel. He found wholesale prices for the meat to feed the lions. He routed their tour to follow the payday schedules of the factory towns, ensuring maximum attendance. The circus began to make money, real money. The manager took all the credit, of course. He bought new suits. He started wearing gold rings. He bragged in taverns about his business acumen. He would slap Victor on the back during the day and say, "Good growling today, frog," treating him like a favored pet. But Victor didn't care about the credit. He cared about the cut. 10%. Every Friday, late at night, the manager would slide an envelope under the door of the black wagon. Inside were coins, sovereigns, banknotes. Victor didn't spend a penny. He didn't buy liquor. He didn't buy women. He didn't buy clothes. He saved. He stacked the coins in little towers on his desk. He looked at the money and saw bricks. He saw mortar. He saw foundations. For 3 years, this continued. The circus became famous. The swamp beast was the star attraction, and Mr. Shade, the mysterious administrator whom nobody ever saw, was the most feared negotiator on the circuit. Bank managers would receive letters from Mr. Shade and marvel at his financial precision. They imagined a stiff, elderly solicitor in a dusty office in London. They never imagined a man sitting cross-legged on the floor of a moving wagon with skin like tree bark, writing by the light of a single tallow candle. But making money wasn't enough for Victor. He had learned the lesson of the storm and the lesson of the stage. You can't just participate in the system. The system will eat you. You have to own the system. And to own the system, you need to understand compound interest. Not just of money, but of humiliation. Victor realized that every jeer from the crowd, every laugh, every insult, he could monetize it. He was charging them for the privilege of hating him. And he was using their money to buy something they could never take away. One afternoon, in a town called Sheffield, the circus set up on a muddy lot next to a row of boarding houses. The owner of the boarding houses was a desperate man, drowning in debt, looking to sell quickly. He came to the circus office looking for the manager, but the manager was out gambling. He found the black wagon instead. He knocked. "I'm looking for Mr. Shade," the landlord said to the closed door. "I heard he buys liabilities." A slip of paper slid out from under the door. "State your price." The negotiation took 10 minutes. The paper slid back and forth. The landlord never saw the face inside. He only saw the handwriting. He only saw the money that slid out at the end, a stack of banknotes tied in twine, smelling faintly of the circus. That night, while Victor sat in his tank, roaring at the frightened children, he looked out the window of the tent. He could see the boarding house across the street. He looked at the roof. He looked at the windows. He owned it. He was the landlord. The people throwing peanuts at him, they were going to go home, sleep in his beds, and pay him rent in the morning. A smile touched Victor's lips. It was the first time he had smiled in years. A small, terrible, satisfied smile. The manager walked by, poked him with a cane, and whispered, "Look scary, you idiot." Victor growled on cue, but in his mind, he was already calculating the yield on the rental income. He was beginning to understand that true power isn't about standing in the light. True power is becoming the landlord of the dark. But as with all things built on secrets, the foundation was fragile. Victor was disciplined. He was careful. But he had made one critical mistake in his calculations. He had factored in the market, the weather, and the crowds. He hadn't factored in the manager's ego. Success is dangerous for a foolish man. The manager had become rich thanks to Victor's brain, and like all fools who get rich without working for it, he started to believe he was invincible. He stopped listening to Mr. Shade. He stopped respecting the ledger. And then he found the gambling tables. And while the manager sat at the green baize tables in the smoke-filled parlors of Manchester and Liverpool, throwing gold sovereigns at bad cards, Victor was doing something far more dangerous. He was buying the map. I want you to picture the inside of that black wagon in 1835. It was small, smelling of ink and old pine. But on the wall, hidden behind a heavy curtain, Victor had pinned a map of England. And on that map, he had placed red pins. Every pin was a property. Every pin was a building where he, Mr. Shade, held the deed. He owned the coaching inn in Derby where the circus troupe slept. He owned the grazing field in York where the horses ate. He owned the warehouse in Bristol where they stored the winter gear. Think of the exquisite irony. During the day, the people of these towns would come to the tent, pay a penny, and scream at the monster in the mud. They would call him a squatter, a vagrant, a thing that didn't belong in God's country. And then at night, those same people would go back to their rented rooms, lie down in beds that Victor owned, and pay him for the privilege of sleeping. He was their landlord, and they didn't even know his name. He was extracting a tax on their very existence, a silent reparation for every stone they threw. It was a cold kind of satisfaction, yes. It was lonely, but it was secure, or so he thought. Victor believed that if he controlled the land, he controlled his fate. He believed that money was a wall that no insult could breach, but he had forgotten that he was still, on paper, a piece of property himself. The unraveling happened in November, the month of dead leaves. The manager had been losing steadily for weeks. It started with small losses. The gate receipts for a Tuesday, the profit from the popcorn sales. But a gambler does not stop when he hits zero. A gambler digs a hole in the ground and convinces himself he will find gold at the bottom. The manager stopped paying the feed bills. Victor, seeing this in the ledger, covered the costs from his own private Mr. Shade accounts, annotating it as a loan to the circus. He thought he was saving the business. In reality, he was feeding the manager's addiction. The manager realized that the bills were miraculously being paid, so he took it as a sign that luck was on his side and he bet more. It ended in a private club in the docklands of London, a place where the air was thick with opium smoke and the smell of wet wool. The manager was drunk. He was sitting across from a man with cold eyes and a heavy gold ring, a creditor of the worst sort. The game was fair open. The manager was down 3,000 pounds. "I can pay," the manager slurred, sweating through his silk vest, a vest Victor had paid for. "I have assets. I have the finest show in the Midlands." "You have wagons," the creditor said, shuffling the deck. "Wood rots, horses die. What do you have that holds value?" The manager looked at his cards. He had nothing. The deed to his own caravan was already gone. The tent was mortgaged, but he had one thing left. One contract. An exclusive lifetime contract for a unique biological specimen. He hesitated. For a moment, perhaps, just for a flicker of a heartbeat, he remembered the rainy night in Leeds when Victor saved the tent. He remembered the ledgers balanced with perfect precision. He remembered the man who had made him rich. But then he looked at the pile of chips in the center of the table. He looked at the bottle of brandy, and he drowned his conscience. "I have the frogman," the manager whispered. "Victor, he is unique. There is no other like him in the world. The Academy of Sciences offered me a fortune for him 5 years ago. He is worth 5,000, alive or dead." The creditor stopped shuffling. He looked interested. "Alive or dead?" "Both," the manager said, his voice trembling. "Ideally alive, but the contract is for the body." He bet the contract. He threw Victor's life onto the green, felt like a poker chip, and he lost. Victor didn't know. He was in his wagon, calculating the yield on a row of cottages in Surrey. He was safe in his world of numbers. He didn't feel the moment his ownership of his own skin evaporated. He didn't feel the pen scratch across the transfer document in London, signing him over to a debt collector who dealt in flesh. The next morning, the manager returned to the camp. He looked gray. He looked like a man who had seen his own ghost. He wouldn't meet Victor's eyes. He walked past the tank without his usual jeer. He locked himself in his caravan and drank. Victor sensed the shift. The atmosphere in the camp was brittle. The roustabouts were whispering. The lions were restless. Victor checked the ledger. The numbers were perfect, but the soul of the place was rotting. He wrote a note to the manager, sliding it under the door. "The accounts show a surplus. Why are you hiding?" No answer came. 2 days later, the letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to Mr. Shade. It was addressed to the manager, bearing the wax seal of the Royal College of Surgeons, but not the public department. It was the darker branch, the Department of Teratology, the study of monsters. Victor intercepted the post, as he always did. It was part of his job as the secret clerk. He held the envelope in his hand. It felt heavy, cold. He shouldn't have opened it. It was a breach of his own rules. But dread is a powerful key. He broke the seal. He read the words, and for the first time in his life, Victor's hands shook. Regarding the acquisition of the specimen known as Victor, pickup scheduled for the 14th. Transfer of ownership complete. We have prepared the preservation tank. formal study to commence immediately upon termination of vital functions. Termination of vital functions. They weren't buying a performer. They were buying a corpse that hadn't died yet. The manager hadn't just sold his contract. He had sold him to a museum that intended to pickle him in a jar for medical students to gawk at. The debts the manager had racked up were so high that only the sale of a scientific curiosity could cover them. Victor sat in his black wagon. He looked at the map on the wall. He looked at the deeds to the boarding houses. He looked at the stack of gold coins on his desk. He was a wealthy man. He was a property tycoon. He was a genius. And yet, in the eyes of the law, he was livestock. If the constables came with that paper, they would chain him. They wouldn't care about his bank account. They wouldn't let him speak. He would be dragged out, stripped, and hauled away to a cold stone room in London where men with saws and rulers were waiting to see what was underneath his skin. This was the final pit, the deepest one. Poverty is one thing. You can climb out of poverty. Ridicule is one thing. You can ignore ridicule. But this was the erasure of the human soul. This was being told that your only value is the geometry of your bones. He stood up. He walked to the small mirror in his wagon. He touched the thick, patterned skin on his face. He touched the ridges that made people scream. "I am a man," he said to the empty room. "I am a man." But words don't stop chains. He heard the sound of wheels on gravel. Heavy wheels, not circus wheels. These were iron-rimmed carriage wheels, the kind that carry prisoners or coffins. It was early morning, the mist still clinging to the ground. Victor looked out through the slats of his window. A black carriage had pulled up to the main gate. It had no windows in the rear compartment. Two men stepped out. They wore heavy coats and tall, severe hats. They carried no whips. They carried restraints, leather cuffs reinforced with steel, attached to a long chain. They were professionals. They were collectors. The manager stepped out of his caravan to meet them. He looked pathetic. He was shaking, clutching a handkerchief. He pointed toward the tent. He pointed toward the mud tank where Victor was supposed to be sleeping. He is in there, the manager stammered. "Be quick about it. Don't let him speak. If he speaks, it makes it difficult." The collectors nodded. They walked toward the terrarium with purpose. Victor watched them. He had minutes, maybe seconds. He could run. He knew the woods. He could grab his cash box and vanish into the forest. But if he ran, he would be a fugitive forever. He would be a hunted animal, living in ditches, afraid of every shadow. Everything he had built, the properties, the accounts, the dignity of Mr. Shade would be gone. He would just be the frogman on the run. Number. Running was what animals did. Men stood their ground. Victor looked at his desk. He looked at the ledger, the heavy red book that contained the secrets of the last 5 years. He looked at a bundle of debt notes he had purchased from the landlord in Sheffield. He looked at the promissory notes he had bought from the grain merchants. He realized then that he had a weapon. It wasn't a knife. It wasn't a gun. It was the truth. He didn't put on his loincloth. He didn't put on the mud. He opened his trunk. He took out the tuxedo he had worn on that disastrous night 3 years ago. It was clean now, pressed. He put on the white shirt. He tied the silk cravat. He put on the coat. It fit him perfectly. He picked up the red ledger. He picked up the stack of papers bound in twine. He opened the door of his wagon and stepped out into the mist. The collectors were at the tank, realizing it was empty. They were turning, confused. The manager was wiping sweat from his forehead, looking around in panic. "Gentlemen," Victor's voice rang out, clear, authoritative, the voice of a barrister, not a beast. They all turned. Victor walked toward them. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't look like a specimen. He looked like the owner of the estate. The morning sun caught the strange patterns on his face, but he didn't hide them. He wore his skin like armor. "I believe you are looking for property that belongs to this establishment," Victor said, stopping 10 feet away from them. The manager's jaw dropped. "Get back in the cage, Victor. Don't talk. Just get in the..." "Quiet," Victor said. He didn't shout. He just dropped the word like a gavel. And the manager, for the first time in history, shut his mouth. Victor turned to the men with the chains. "You have a bill of sale, I presume?" One of the collectors, confused by the tuxedo and the vocabulary, nodded slowly. He pulled a paper from his coat. "Signed by the owner. Transfer of all assets, livestock, and curiosities to the Royal Academy in exchange for the settlement of debts totaling £4,000. "I see," Victor said. He adjusted his cuffs. "A legal transaction. Very proper." He took a step closer. The manager was trembling now, sensing something terrible in Victor's calmness. "The contract is valid," Victor said, "only if the seller owns the asset. That is the law, is it not? You cannot sell what you do not own." "I own you," the manager screamed, his fear turning into aggression. "I own the wagons. I own the tent. I own the contract. Take him. Seize him." Victor opened the red ledger. He held it up. "Actually," Victor said, "according to this ledger, which records every financial transaction of this company for the last 36 months, and according to these promissory notes," he dropped a stack of papers onto the ground. They landed with a heavy thud. "The manager does not own this circus." He looked the manager in the eye. "You borrowed £3,000 against the wagons, did you not? You defaulted last month. The debt was purchased by a holding company called the Shade and Company." Victor tapped his own chest. "I am Mr. Shade." The silence that followed was absolute. The lions stopped pacing. The wind stopped blowing. The manager looked at the papers on the ground. He looked at the frogman standing in a tuxedo. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The clerk he had mocked, the beast he had exploited. He had been paying him to buy his own chains. Victor continued, his voice cold as ice. "I own the wagons, I own the horses, I own the tent poles, I own the feed bags, and, most importantly, I own your debts, sir. Which means, legally speaking, I own the circus. You are not the proprietor. You are an employee who has been stealing from the company accounts." He turned back to the collectors. "So, gentlemen, the man who signed your bill of sale has no authority to sell anything. Not even a bucket of water. The contract is void." The collectors looked at each other. They looked at the manager, who was now sinking to his knees in the dirt, destroyed by the weight of his own arithmetic. They looked at Victor, strange, terrifying, magnificent Victor. "Void?" the collector asked. "Void," Victor said. "Now please remove your carriage from my driveway. You are blocking the delivery entrance." It was the greatest performance of his life. He wasn't doing magic. He wasn't lifting weights. He was using the sheer, brutal force of bureaucracy to crush a man who thought he was untouchable. But as the carriage turned around, leaving the chains unused in the fact, the victory wasn't complete. The manager was broken. Yes, the collectors were gone. Yes, but Victor was standing in the middle of a circus he now owned, a circus that hated him. The performers were coming out of their wagons. They were staring. They saw the freak holding the keys to the kingdom. He had saved his life, but he had to decide what to do with it. Did he want to be the new master? Did he want to be the king of the freaks? Did he want to spend the rest of his life managing the very spectacle that had humiliated him? Victor looked at the tent. He looked at the muddy ring where he had squatted for 5 years. He looked at the manager, weeping in the dust. And he realized that owning the prison doesn't make you free. Closing it does. It was a Tuesday when the devil came to collect, but he didn't come to the circus grounds. He came to a place in town called the Gilded Lantern. That was a card parlor, the kind with heavy velvet curtains that smelled of old cigar smoke and spilled whiskey. The kind of place where sunlight wasn't allowed inside because sunlight tells the truth. And nobody in the Gilded Lantern wanted to know what time it was. Our manager, the man who had owned Victor's life since he was a starving boy in the alley, sat at a round table. I have seen the records of that night. Not the official police records, mind you, but the markers. The I.O.U.S. I found them in a box in the basement of this very hotel, wrapped in oilcloth. They tell a story of a man who was sweating through his silk shirt. A man who kept doubling his bet because he believed, like all fools do, that the next card would fix the last 10 bad ones. He didn't lose his money all at once. It was a slow bleed. First, the gold in his pocket. Then, the rings on his fingers. He bet the receipts from the upcoming show. He lost those. Then, desperation set in. You have to understand, a man like that, his pride is the only thing holding his spine straight. If he walked away then, he would be poor. If he stayed, he might be rich again. So he stayed. He bet the horses, the magnificent gray stallions that pulled the lead wagon. He lost them to a riverboat captain with cold eyes. He bet the costume trunk. He bet the big canvas tent itself. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, with his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold his glass, he realized he had nothing left. The circus was gone. He had gambled away the roof over his head and the wheels under his feet. But the man across the table, he smiled. He knew the manager had one thing left. One thing that didn't have a deed, but had a value. The creature, the man said. The frog man. Sign over his contract. Now, I want you to think about that. Victor was sleeping in his wagon, breathing the cool night air, believing he had earned his rest. And 3 miles away in a smoke-filled room, a pen was scratching across a piece of paper, selling him like he was a sack of flour. The manager signed. He signed because he thought it would buy him one more hand of cards. It didn't save him. He lost that hand too. He walked back to the camp as the sun was coming up. He walked slow. The whiskey had worn off, and the fear was setting in. He knew the men were coming to collect the horses. He knew the men were coming to take the tent. But worst of all, he knew the men were coming from the academy. That's what they called it. The Academy of Science. It sounds grand, doesn't it? But for people like Victor, the academy wasn't a school. It was a jar. It was a place where you didn't perform. You were preserved. You were studied. You were never let out. Victor was up early. He was sitting on the steps of his wagon, polishing his shoes. He always kept his shoes clean. It was a small thing, but it was his way of saying, "I am a gentleman." He saw the manager coming through the mist. He saw the way the man wouldn't meet his eyes. Then came the sound, the rattle of chains. A black carriage rolled onto the lot. It didn't have colorful flags. It had iron bars on the windows. 2 men got out. They wore gray suits and carried a heavy leather strap. They didn't look at Victor like he was a person. They looked at him like he was a package they had to load. The manager finally spoke. His voice was cracked like a broken plate. He pointed a shaking finger at Victor. "That's him," he whispered. "Take him. The debt is paid." The roustabouts, the strong men who pounded the stakes and raised the canvas, they stopped their work. They held their hammers in midair. They liked Victor. He had saved them during the storm. But they were simple men, and they were afraid of the law. And these men in gray suits, they had the paper. They had the law. One of the agents stepped forward. He took a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. "Step down, specimen," he said. "Don't make us drag you. The academy doesn't like damaged goods." Victor stood up. He didn't look at the agent. He looked at the manager. He looked at him with that same calm, deep stare that he used to give the crowds when they screamed at him. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. Victor reached inside his jacket. The agents flinched. They thought he was going for a knife. The roustabouts tensed up, ready for a fight. But Victor didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a book, a black ledger, and a small, neat stack of papers tied with a red ribbon. He walked down the steps, right past the agent with the cuffs, and placed the book on top of a barrel. He opened it. The pages didn't show a script for a play. They showed numbers. Columns and columns of beautiful, precise numbers. "I believe," Victor said, and his voice was clear, loud enough for every stable boy and ticket taker to hear. "I believe there is a misunderstanding regarding ownership." The manager laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "There's no misunderstanding, boy. I sold you. Your property. You're nothing." Victor opened the ribbon on the stack of papers. He picked up the top one. "This," he said, "is the note for the feed bill from 3 months ago, unpaid by the circus, purchased by Mr. Shade." He dropped the paper on the barrel. He picked up the next one. "This is the lien on the main tent canvas. The manufacturer was never paid. He sold the debt to Mr. Shade." He dropped it. The paper fluttered down. He picked up another. "And this is the mortgage on the wagons, including the one you sleep in, sir. It was acquired by the trust of Mr. Shade 6 months ago." The manager's face went pale. The red drained out of him until he looked like wet dough. "Who is Mr. Shade?" he screamed. "I'll kill him. Where is he?" Victor closed the book. He rested his hand on the cover. He looked at his own skin, the rough, patterned skin that the world called a monster's hide. Then he looked at the manager. "I am Mr. Shade," Victor said. The silence that fell over that camp was heavier than the storm. The agent with the handcuffs lowered his arms. He looked from the manager to Victor, and he began to do the math in his head. "You," the manager whispered, "but you're in a tank. You're an animal." "I am the bookkeeper," Victor corrected, "and I have purchased every debt you created. I own the wagons. I own the tent. I own the route." He turned to the men in the gray suits. He didn't flinch. "And regarding the contract for my person, That contract was signed by the owner of this circus. Since the previous owner has forfeited all assets to satisfy his creditors, the authority to sell contracts now belongs to the new owner. Victor tapped his own chest. I do not recall selling myself to you, gentlemen, he said softly. You are trespassing on private property. Kindly remove your carriage before I charge you a docking fee. The agent looked at the paperwork on the barrel. He saw the stamps. He saw the bank seals. He was a bureaucrat, and bureaucrats respect paper more than they respect people. He tipped his hat, just a little bit. Apologies, mister. Shade, he said. He put the handcuffs away. Seems we were misinformed. They got in their black carriage and they drove away. The dust settled. The manager was left standing there, small and trembling. He looked at Victor, waiting for the blow, waiting for the revenge. He expected Victor to lock him in the cage, to make him the freak. But Victor was tired. He was so tired of cages. Pack your things, Victor said to him. You can take the horse you rode in on if you can find the man who won it and buy it back. But leave my lot. You are terminated for gross incompetence. The manager ran. He didn't walk, he ran. He disappeared into the trees and into the history books of forgotten men. That left Victor standing in the center of the ring. The roustabouts, the acrobats, the bearded lady, the strong man, they all gathered around. They were smiling, they were clapping. They thought surely this was the beginning of a golden age. The Frogman Circus. They thought they would be rich. But Victor looked at the big tent. He looked at the painted banners that called him a beast from the slime. He looked at the ticket booth where people paid 10 cents to laugh at him. He turned to the head roustabout. Strike the tent, he said. Sir? The man asked. For the evening show? For good, Victor answered. He opened his ledger one last time. He called every worker up by name, and from a strong box in his wagon, he paid them. He didn't just give them their week's wages, he gave them severance. He gave them enough to get home, or to start a shop, or to feed their families for a season. He emptied the box. He didn't want the circus money. He said it felt greasy in his hands. When the camp was empty, when the last wagon had rolled away and the sun was setting orange and low over the fields, Victor built a fire. He went into his wagon and he brought out the costume. That green rubber loincloth. The fake webbed gloves they made him wear. The poster with the screaming red letters. He threw them onto the fire. He watched them curl and turn to black smoke. He watched the lye burn. He stood there for a long time, warming his hands. For the first time in 20 years, nobody was looking at him. There was no audience. There was just a man by a fire under the vast open sky. He took a deep breath, and it didn't smell of sawdust or popcorn. It smelled of rain and earth and freedom. He put on his best suit, the charcoal wool one with the silk vest. He picked up his ledger. He picked up his suitcase. And he started walking. He didn't walk toward the next town on the route. He walked toward the train station. He bought a ticket for a place that was quiet. A place where nobody knew him as a frog, but only as a man with cash in his pocket and a quiet way of speaking. We are back in the lobby now. The fire in the fireplace is dying down. It's late. You asked me at the start of this night why I keep this old registry book in a glass case. You asked me who VR was, the man who signed the first page as guest and the last page as proprietor. I think you know. Victor didn't disappear. He came here. This hotel? It wasn't a hotel then. It was a failing manor house on the edge of the county. He bought it. Cash. He fixed the roof himself. He planted the gardens. He hired a cook. He never put up a sign that said freak show. He put up a sign that said rest. He lived here for 40 years. He married a woman who was blind. Did you know that? She was a piano teacher from the village. People whispered, of course. People always whisper. They said, oh, it's good she's blind, so she doesn't have to see him. But she used to tell my father, yes, my father, that she saw him better than anyone else. She saw a man who never raised his voice, a man who read to her every night, a man who smelled of clean soap and old paper. She didn't love a monster. She loved a gentleman. Victor passed away in his sleep in the room right above us in 1912. It was a peaceful death. No crowds, no applause. Just the ticking of a clock and the holding of a hand. He left me this hotel, he left me this book, but mostly he left the lesson, the one I've been trying to tell you all night. We all get dealt a hand. Sometimes it's a bad hand. Sometimes the world looks at you and sees something broken, or strange, or weak. They try to put you in a tank. They try to write a label for you. Failure. Victim. Useless. Victor didn't fight them with fists. He didn't scream at the darkness. He turned on a light. He learned the rules of their game better than they knew them. He turned his silence into a plan. He turned his difference into his shield. And when the time was right, he didn't ask for his freedom, he bought it. So, look in the mirror tomorrow. If you don't like what you see, or if the world is laughing at you, remember the man who was half frog. Remember that he ended up owning the bank that once refused to loan him a dime. Go on now, it's late. The kitchen is closed, but if you look closely at the bill I just gave you, you'll see the math is perfect. We take pride in our numbers here. Good night.